The Art of Creation, Essays on the Self and Its Powers, by Edward Carpenter. These two things, the spiritual and the material, though we call them by different names, in their origin are one and the same. Lao Tzu. When a new desire has declared itself in the human heart, when a new plexus is forming among the nerves, then the revolutions of nations are already decided, and histories unwritten are written towards democracy. Preface. We seem to be arriving at a time when, with the circling of our knowledge of the globe, a great synthesis of all human thought on the ancient and ever-engrossing problem of creation is quite naturally and inevitably taking shape. The world-old wisdom of the Upanishads, with their profound and impregnable doctrine of the universal self, the teachings of Buddha or of Lao Tzu, the poetic insight of Plato, the inspired sayings of Jesus and Paul, the speculations of Plotinus or of the Gnostics, and the wonderful contributions of later European thought, from the 14th century mystics down through Spinoza, Berkeley, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Fourier, and others. All these, combining with the immense mass of material furnished by modern physical and biological science and psychology, are preparing a great birth, as it were. And out of this meeting of elements is already arising the dim outline of a philosophy which must surely dominate human thought for a long period. A new philosophy we can hardly expect or wish for, since indeed the same germinal thoughts of the Vedic authors come all the way down history, even to Schopenhauer and Whitman, inspiring philosophy after philosophy and religion after religion. But it is only today that our knowledge of the world enables us to recognize this immense consensus, and it is only today that science, with its huge conquests in the material plane, is able to provide, for these world-old principles, somewhat of a new form, and so wonderful a garment of illustration and expression as it does. The philosophy of the Upanishads was nothing if not practical, and the same has been said by every great religion of its own teaching. Do the will, and ye shall know of the doctrine. It is not sufficient to study and investigate the art of creation as an external problem. We have to learn and to practice the art in ourselves. So alone it will become vital and really intelligible to us. The object of the present volume is to show something of both these sides, the speculative and the practical. Chapter 1. Preliminary. Related motion seems to be, as suggested by the words attraction and repulsion, gravitation, chemical affinity, and so forth, the ground fact of inorganic nature. And it seems also to be the ground and foundation of life. The protoplasmic jelly moves towards or away from substances in its neighborhood, and this appears to be its fundamental property. The most primitive cellular organisms act in the same way. Some seek light, others flee from it. Paramecium is drawn towards slightly acid substances, and flies from alkalis. Actinophorus is attracted by starch, and so on. There appears to be a kind of choice or elective affinity, and the learned are divided on the subject into two schools. Those who, like Binet, see in these movements of protozoa the germinal characteristics of human intelligence, and those who class them as, quote, merely chemical and automatic reactions. It is not our business here to draw the line of division. It is sufficient to see that on the very lowest rung of the ladder of life, and at a point where it is difficult to distinguish its laws from those of chemistry, such words as we are forced to use, words like attraction, repulsion, affinity, have a double meaning. covering both material and mental, external and internal affections. Even the word motion itself passes easily into emotion. And modern psychology and physiology have made it abundantly clear that every feeling or emotion in the mind means motion of some kind in the tissues or fluids of the body. Some of our highest and most complex emotions take the form of attraction or repulsion, and in our dimmest sensations, almost below the level of consciousness, we still can detect the same. All nature is motion. In the most primitive life, there is a tendency to motion, provoked by a neighboring object. This capacity to be provoked into motion is called irritability, and in a higher degree, sensibility. All these words, tendency, irritability, sensibility, have a mental as well as physical import, which it is difficult to escape from. If a protozoic cell does not feel, quote, desire for food such as we feel, it exhibits a tendency towards it, which we can hardly refuse to regard as the germ of desire. Over the question of the priority of the mental or the material aspects of cells and other things, there has been much discussion, some maintaining that chemical and automatic reactions come first, and that later, out of these, mental phenomena are evolved, while others insist that consciousness in some form is prior, and the material world only its expression. I think it best and simplest to suppose the two simultaneous and coextensive, and I shall, provisionally, assume this position, leaving the question to clear itself up later in the book. I may, however, here quote two passages from Lloyd Morgan's Introduction to Comparative Psychology. Speaking of consciousness in some form as accompanying all vital organization, he says, "Does it not seem reasonable to suppose that no matter what stage we select, analysis would still disclose the two aspects? That with the simpler modes of nerve energy, there would go simpler modes of consciousness, and that with infraneural modes of energy, there would be infraconsciousness, or that from which consciousness as we know it has arisen in process of evolution." And again, speaking of a dog as having grown from a single fertilized egg cell, "From what then have its states of consciousness been evolved? Do we not seem forced by parity of reasoning to answer? From something more simple than consciousness, but of the same order of existence, which answers subjectively to the simpler organic energy of the fertilized ovum." That is, he supposes that associated with the egg cell is a subconsciousness of some kind, which expands into the fuller consciousness, pari passu, with the evolution of the egg cell into the dog. Let us assume for the present that mind and matter are simultaneous and coextensive. Then, on the latter side, we have an ascending scale, first, purely inorganic substances, if there are such, then crystals, protoplasmic cells, vegetation, the animal world, man, and whatever beings are superior to man. While on the mental side, corresponding, we have simple attraction and repulsion, selective affinity, irritability, sensibility, simple consciousness, self-consciousness, and such higher stages of consciousness as are beyond. Taking this view, we are enabled to abandon the somewhat futile attempts which have been made in all ages to separate mind and matter, and to glorify one over the other, sometimes mind over matter, and sometimes matter over mind. These attempts have led mankind into all sorts of bogs, which we may hope now simply to pass by and leave behind. There is a distinction between mind and matter, as of two aspects of the same thing, but no real separation. This subject is dealt with at more length in the chapter on Matter and Consciousness, Chapter 3. We may say here, however, that the distinction between mind and matter forces us to conceive, or try to conceive, of a, quote, stuff prior to both, a something of which they are the two aspects, and thus we come to the world-old idea of primitive being, before all differentiation, emanation, or expression, or the, quote, will of the later philosophers, Schopenhauer, Hartmann, Royce, and others. This will or being is absolutely not thinkable by the ordinary consciousness, except as a necessary ground for other thoughts, for obviously it lies beyond the region of thought. I shall, however, endeavor to show that it is known in the stage of cosmic consciousness, transcending our ordinary consciousness. The perception of matter and mind as distinct things belongs only to our ordinary self-consciousness. This distinction is not known in the earlier stage of simple consciousness, and it passes away again in the higher and more perfect stage of the, quote, cosmic consciousness. Nevertheless, though matter and mind are not separable, and may be regarded as two aspects of one reality, there are advantages in cases in treating one as prior to the other. As a rule, since our mental states are the things that are nearest to us, and that we know best, it seems wisest to begin from the mental side. Then, if we explain material things in terms of mind, we explain things little known in terms of things better known. Whereas if we explain mental things in terms of matter, we are elucidating things inadequately known by means of things less known. Nevertheless, the superior definiteness of the material world over the mental is a great advantage in favor of the former. There are many things which can be clearly seen from the objective side, which would escape us from the subjective, and a healthy materialism, side by side with the other view, has its proper and important use, and is by no means to be neglected. In addition to the debate as to which is prior, mind or matter, there is the further controversy as to which, in the constitution of the mind itself, comes first and is most fundamental, feeling or intellect. This question, however, is not quite on all fours with the other, for the question of mind and matter is mainly a metaphysical one, as of two possible aspects of being, whereas the other is rather a question of observation and of the order of evolution. I think it will become clear to anyone who thinks carefully about the question that notwithstanding a vast amount of interaction between the two, feeling is more fundamental than intellect, and prior to it in the order of expression and evolution. Vague desire arises in the mind before it ever takes any form sufficiently definite to be characterized as thought. This subject, however, I deal with in Chapter 2, more in detail, and I will not dwell upon it here. What we have just said about the necessity of positing a state of being prior to mind, as we use that term, and matter, indicates to us, and it is necessary to dwell upon this for a moment, that the problem of the universe is essentially insoluble to our ordinary thought. It is necessary to face this fact fairly and squarely, because by blinking it and deceiving ourselves, we get landed in hopeless morasses and vain quests. The problem of the universe is essentially insoluble without the introduction of some transcendent factor, will, being, the ego, a fourth dimension, or whatever we may term it. The ordinary consciousness, forced to see everything under the double form of subject and object, mind and matter, cannot escape this dual compulsion, and yet, at the same time, its own constitution compels it to realize and to assume that there is another order of being, unpresentable in thought, in which the duality is merged in unity. It is thus, as it were by its own action, driven against a wall which it cannot overpass, and forced to set a barrier to its own further progress. Immensely valuable as is the work which physical science has done, it suffers from this disability which must be fairly faced, namely, that it can never by any possibility explain the situation, since it moves always on one side of a fixed wall or fence. To pass the fence, transcendental things have to be assumed, and that means that at a certain point the ordinary mind must throw up the sponge. The situation would be desperate were it not that perfectly naturally and inevitably in its due time another order of consciousness opens out, which reconciles subject and object, mind and matter, and having one leg firmly planted on the other side, lifts us gently over the stile. In the 2 chapters on the self and its affiliations, I have assumed that the ego, a transcendental being, descends into and manifests itself in our ordinary world of time and space, and that even as the ego of the tiniest cell, it has a potential existence far transcending the minute speck of protoplasm, which we can actually see or analyze. This may be thought to be an enormous and unwarrantable assumption, but I have given the reason why assumptions of some such kind are unavoidable. And it may be pointed out that if, endeavoring to keep to the lines of pure physical science, we barred out such assumptions, we should only be landed in an infinity and an unthinkability of another kind. For to understand and define a single tiniest cell, it is a mere truism of science to say, we should have to understand and define all its environment in space and time, or in other words, the whole universe. If therefore we find the subject becomes more thinkable by assuming, say, a fourth-dimensional being, than by following the ramifications of, quote, matter and force, into infinite space and time, we are quite justified in adopting the former method. For while we have to admit, on the one hand, that these problems cannot be fully worked out by ordinary thought, we are bound, on the other hand, and we necessarily desire, to make their solutions as thinkable as possible. Thinkable in some degree, our views of the world must be, even if not absolutely true, or else we cannot use them in our ordinary lives. And however, in course of time, our ordinary modes of thought may be illuminated by a superior order of consciousness, they will still retain their importance and their value in their own sphere. To show the limits of ordinary thought and the points where the various problems hand themselves over to other stages of consciousness is part of the object of this series of papers. It is in these stages of consciousness and their succession, which is a practical matter, that the solution of the great world problems will, I think, be found. And many of the present riddles of existence, which vex us so, will, when we compass the cosmic stage, simply be left lying as matters of no importance. Not to say left lying, as seen to be the delusive things they are.